I think we need to brace ourselves for a potential betrayal to also take place in relation with Israel. I think we need to accept that a betrayal is coming because Israel's two main war goals are the release of the hostages and the destruction of Hamas. And it could absolutely be feasible for me to see a situation in which the American administration forces the Israeli government to accept a situation in which the hostages are released and Israel commits itself to accepting the pre-October 7th reality, which is the restoration of Hamas in power in Gaza.
Wow. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. And today, his patience has been absolutely great. Is Yoni Michanie. Yoni, thank you so much for joining me today.
But the pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm honored, and we're going to have a conversation that our listeners are going to appreciate a lot with your background, your expertise, and also your advocacy, and you're just being outspoken into what's happening in Israel and getting to know your perspective, your point of view on that. So before that, I would love for our listeners to just get a brief outlook on your trajectory, Yoni. What's been your trajectory like?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Argentina. My family moved to the States in the early 2000s. And after going through high school and college in South Florida, Operation Protective Edge broke out in 2014. That was one of the more intense rounds of fighting between Israel and Gaza. And so I decided to move to Israel, enlist in the IDF. I served with the paratroopers for 2 years. After that, went on to get my master's in diplomacy from Reichman University. Worked for an organization called the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, and then the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. And currently, I am concluding my doctoral program at Northeastern University.
Awesome. I was actually in Israel in 2014 during that clash between Israel and Hamas and Palestine. So, yes, I remember we couldn't go into Tel Aviv that time. We were doing like the whole tour. But Yoni, this is quite a trajectory. And so now that you're getting your master's in international relations and working on that front of the equation, you were a paratrooper, now you're sort of like the diplomacy side of things. What's your outlook now in terms of what you're seeing? I can throw out the first question that I had, which was, you've highlighted Palestinian rejectionism as a key driver of this conflict. And I've never, like I told you before recording, I've never heard that concept before. So going into, of course, now it's March 2025, which has flown by. What do you have any moments throughout the year deepen this perspective on the Palestinian rejectionism? And can you share with us what that's about?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Just a small correction from before. I'm finishing my PhD right now, not my master's.
And you said it, and I apologize again.
No, not at all.
Babbling is.
So yeah, Palestinian rejectionism is an interesting concept, one that is conveniently not spoken enough about. It has its origins really at the onset of the Balfour Declaration in 1917. By that point, the newly established Mandate of Palestine, which had come about as a fall of the Ottoman Empire and the assumption of the territory itself by the British, transforming it from the provincial name Palestine to the actual Mandate of Palestine. By that point, Jews had already undergone several waves of immigration to the land. The construction of prominent cities like Tel Aviv, Rishon LeZion, and Petah Tikva, cities that are still standing and growing to this day, have already been set in terms of the foundation. And the conflict between the Jews and Arabs in the land was just developing, but really it's heightened to new levels once the British um, agree to allow the Jews to establish a homeland in the Mandate of Palestine. Now, the term homeland was very vague. There was no mention of a state, of course, and there was no reference as to which part of the land the Jews could technically develop into their own homeland, because the Mandate of Palestine stretched into modern-day Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Palestinian rejectionism is really then seen unfolding because the Arab community living in the Mandate of Palestine really understands that the Zionist project now has the backing of one of the most prominent governments around the world. And so, with the understanding that the Jewish prospects for the establishment of a state inside of that homeland is becoming more realistic, the Arabs really start to embrace a policy of anti-immigration. The idea was rooted in pushing back against any form of British permission allowing Jews to immigrate to the land. For some time, the British actually acquiesced. They published the first set of white papers in the early 1920s, which restricted Jewish immigration to the land. But Jewish immigration was still happening at lesser numbers than before, but it was still happening, much at the appall, of course, at the Arabs living in the land. In the early 1920s, we have essentially the founding figure of Palestinian nationalism, the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, who is placed into power by the British themselves. They'll come to regret that decision in a few years and eventually exile him to Iraq. But the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini really rallies his base by arguing that it would be both a crime against the Arab world and Islam to allow the Jews to continue to immigrate to the land. Over the years, the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini is able to broaden his base, his political influence, and his religious authority.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to interrupt this episode. I have a huge announcement that I'll be sharing with you just now. My first book ever is out now, called The Time Is Now, a guide to honor your time on Earth. This was a 2-year project that's been in the works. It's a tough love guide to honor your time on Earth. This book will show you how to reclaim your time and energy for what truly matters. Click the link in the show notes and you're gonna see also the link to the domain here, timeisnowbook.com. Order a copy for your loved ones, and I'm so excited for you to dive into it. Thank you.
And by the mid-1930s, 1936, we have the breakout of the Great Arab Revolt. The Great Arab Revolt leads to two outcomes. The first one was the publication of the Peel Commission in 1937, which is the first proposal we have in history in which an outside observer recommended that the Jewish-Arab conflict be resolved by the partitioning of the land. Eventually, the Arabs rejected that proposal. Therefore, we have the origins of Palestinian rejectionism. And the rejectionism was rooted both in the belief that Jewish immigration needed to cease immediately, and that a Arab identity should be formed using the concept of rejecting Jewish immigration to the land. The Great Arab Revolt continues to escalate, and by 1939, the British really acquiesced and signed the second set of white papers, which restrict Jewish immigration far more than the first set. I believe allowing only 5,000 Jews to immigrate to the land. And you can imagine that that number is virtually next to nothing when we're discussing the development of the Holocaust in Europe at the same time. In 1947, we have another partition plan, this time proposed by the United Nations after the British renounced their hold on the British Mandated Palestine, which the Jews again say yes to, the Arabs say no to. In 1967, when the Six-Day War ends, we have another offer made to Palestinian Arabs living in the land, which is turned down. And then again, we have the even more generous offers made by Ehud Barak in 2000, 2001, as well as Prime Minister Olmert in 2007, 2008. Now, Palestinian rejectionism is rooted in the idea that any proposed solution that allows a Jewish state to coexist next to a Palestinian state is unacceptable. It has really its origins in the belief that the Jewish Zionist project would never prevail. And so demanding the full rejection, non-recognition, and the eventual destruction of the Jewish Zionist project is really at the core of Palestinian rejectionism, is based on the idea that Israel is just temporary, and that a better deal or outcome can be achieved by rejecting proposals for peace. The issue is that as time has gone on, the prospects of destroying Israel have gone down for Palestinians living in the land, while for Israel, the prospects of survival have only increased. And so that's sort of the background there on Palestinian rejectionism.
And I'm excited to also announce that I'm going to open through conversations to a members exclusive section only, where you'll be able to access episodes earlier. I'm going to create so many perks for you that I'm excited for. I wanted to get the best value possible, and I've been thinking on how to do it. I want to give you access to early videos. I want to give you also access to, when I record an interview, that you have access real time to just watch while we record, and also to have a live stream, meaning that you can tune in and ask your own questions, your Q&A to some of your favorite guests, and also some of the guests that you don't really know yet, but you would love to hear. And also that way you have some sort of skin in the game, as you're supporting the podcast in some way and you're more invested in the success of it. And so I'm excited for this. Yeah, quite a historical lesson here for me. I appreciate it, and for our listeners, to provide the context. And it's interesting because from what I'm gathering, Yoni, is that the only deal that the Palestinian side will always take is the one that neglects or negates Israeli existence. That's the only deal they will accept. And so with that being said, like you said on right now, is the odds of Israel not existing are diminishing a lot. On the contrary, it's thriving more, correct?
I would say that's the only reasonable conclusion. Look, in 2000, 2001, and 2007, when I refer to those as the most generous peace offers, I said so because virtually every demand that the Palestinians had was met. They would have all of Gaza. They would have a connecting corridor between Gaza and the West Bank. They would have either 96 or 97% of the West Bank, depending which peace offer you're looking at, either the one made by Ehud Barak or Olmert. And they would have additional 3 or 4% of Israel proper to compensate for the land that Israel would retain in the West Bank. In addition to that, a capital was offered in East Jerusalem and a symbolic right of return for a few thousand Palestinians into Israel proper. But both times, both the Yasser Arafat in 2000, 2001 and Mahmoud Abbas in 2007, 2008 chose to walk away from the table. Again, really prioritizing the rejectionist doctrine over really what the Palestinian people essentially needed, which was their leaders' willingness to accept Israel's existence, to accept the fact that a Jewish state existed and it wasn't going to go anywhere, and that now the time had arrived to build a state rather than build a nationalist identity based on the destruction of another.
Wow. Yoni, how does that historical background play into 2025? I feel there's a lot of things going in my mind in terms of, how jokingly or not so jokingly Trump announced Gaza Trump, sort of like that initiative on one hand. On the other hand, the one post that I saved from you, which was, quote, Gaza is the first genocide in history in which the alleged victim refuses to end its own suffering by surrendering or ceasing hostilities. That's another how the story is kind of like twisted in a way, and I say quote unquote genocide. Um, I I think that's the purpose of that post. And then on the other
Yes,
hand,
there was definitely a sarcastic
yeah,
undertone in that tweet.
yeah. And so all of those ideas, factors, historical factors, but also the present moment, having such a tremendous amount of pressure, at least on paper, you could say, because I want to hear your perspective on Trump as well, to get into a solution, a peaceful solution, resolution, but all of the present moment is just here latent. The hostages, the war, the refusal of providing any route towards just a meaningful ceasefire. So I threw a lot of there, Yoni, to you, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. You know, I think I'm not going to make the mistake of presuming to know what is happening in Trump's head. I'm not going to do that, but I will say that I've thought extensively about the type of offer he first put on the table, and the only logical conclusion that I've arrived, and of course I'm open to suggestions all the times from supporters and critics, but the only conclusion that came to mind that was feasible is that Trump was essentially trying to instill a sense both of responsibility and um, urgency into Arab countries' response to the war in Gaza. Historically speaking, they share an enormous part of the responsibility for the current geopolitical situation in the region. Um, Jordan annexed illegally the West Bank for 19 years without offering the Palestinians a viable path to independence. Gaza was occupied by the Egyptians from 1948 to 1967 under a strict military administration, again with no path towards independence. Um, Many of these Arab countries have purposely kept Palestinian refugees and their descendants in refugee camps rather than absorbing them into their own political systems. Um, Much like Israel was forced to do in 1948 when 850,000 Jews were ethnically expelled from Arab countries. And so Israel was forced with the task of absorbing more than 100% of its existing um, population within that same year, um, for the purposes of allowing these Jews to move on from their refugee status and allow them to have a home in which they can build their futures. That kind of future was never offered by Arab countries towards Palestinians. We've even seen throughout the horrific war in Gaza that most countries, until Trump stepped into the Oval Office, hadn't even made a suggestion as to the number of Palestinians they could absorb, for how long they could absorb them, and the role that they would willingly play in the reconstruction of Gaza. Um, so I think Trump's comments were aimed at trying to get Arab countries motivated to take a leadership role in the reconstruction of Gaza. The problem, of course, is that as we saw, the Egyptian proposal, which was brought to the Arab League in a summit in Saudi Arabia for discussion with the wider Arab world, was accepted. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we didn't see a single mechanism that would guarantee and oversee the disarmament of Hamas in Gaza, which should be a basic precondition for the future of Gaza. And this isn't just a pro-Israel position. This is something that I ardently believe that anyone who claims to care about Palestinian lives, which I sincerely do, would also desire to see. The removal of power from a government entity that fueled the war that it knew it couldn't win. And more importantly, it forced the civilian population in Gaza to bear the brunt of the war. The problem that I've found with Trump is that Trump is far more concerned about the ending of war rather than the pursuit of peace. And those are two different objectives, right? War is obviously defined as the constant presence of armed conflict between at least two entities. There's, of course, casualty prerequisites that need to be met for something to be considered a war and not a skirmish, which the war in Gaza has indisputably met in terms of casualties on both sides. But peace cannot be defined as just the absence of war. That is too simplistic a vision for peace. Nor can peace be made out of appeasing adversaries that hold not material grievances, but grievances that are rooted in extreme ideological positions or that are rooted in expansionist gains. This applies just as much as it does to Hamas, to Iran, to Hezbollah, but also to Russia in Ukraine, right? And I think we've seen that side of Trump recently when reports came out showing that the Trump administration, against the wishes of the Israeli government, chose to engage directly in conversations with Hamas, even going as far as putting certain concessions on the table that the Israelis would have to make in exchange for the war coming to an end. I think even more egregiously, you had Steve Witkoff, the peace envoy to the Middle East, assigned by Trump himself, who openly said in front of the cameras the other day that Hamas could use this as an opportunity to gain political capital. But wait a minute, right? A few months ago, President Trump and President Biden were talking about the need to eradicate Hamas from the face of the earth, and now we're talking about extending it political capital. So those kind of things don't add up. And in addition to that, to further justify my concerns, we also recently learned that Trump, by his own admission, reached out to the Iranian government with the hopes of restarting nuclear talks, right? Which, again, is quite a different position to take than the one Trump had throughout his election campaign, and certainly the one held by the Biden administration. Iran was on the verge of economic and political collapse. Perhaps it still is. A nuclear talk that would contain Iran's nuclear program would only do so for a limited amount of time, given that Iran is already so close to breakout capacity. But in addition to that, it would reinvigorate the Iranian economy because any deal that the Iranians sign would have to include the removal of all, if not the most important sanctions that have led to the pariah status that Tehran currently has in the international community. And the last point I'll use to justify my position about the concerns I have regarding the Trump administration is, of course, that really embarrassing display of quote-unquote leadership we saw in the Oval Office when Zelensky was visiting in Washington. The idea that Ukraine's democratically elected president is being called a dictator by the American president, drawing a direct moral equivalence between Zelensky and Putin. The president himself has alleged that Ukraine has responsibility for the breakout of this war, which again is inconsistent with the actions we saw on that February in 2022 when Russian forces deliberately invaded Russian cities and went on to commit heinous crimes against humanity and war crimes. Not to mention the fact that so far at least 20,000 Ukrainian children have been abducted from their homes and reallocated into foster homes inside of Russia or forcibly adopted by Russian families. Um, and so what this leads to on my end is a conclusion that the president is trying to reach what he perceives to be peace, which he's narrowly defining as just the absence of war, for the hopes of achieving temporary silence. And of course, what he's essentially doing is telling our adversaries that all they need to do is shove their expansionist goals aside for 3.5 years until the end of his term, use this time to regroup, and when the next administration comes along, they can do whatever they want. And of course, Trump's legacy would always be protected because he can rely on the quote he loves to say, which is, "Oh, this would have never happened if I were president," right? Um, and so I think the foreign policy approach that we've seen the Trump administration take with Ukraine, which has been one rooted in the abandoning of a country that has fought so courageously on the front lines of European values of not just European, but Western values of liberalism and democracy. But more importantly, a country that has relied and placed its survival on security guarantees that have been offered by numerous American administrations, both Republican and Democratic alike. That's quite concerning. It's a betrayal of epic proportions. And if such a betrayal has made, I think we need to brace ourselves for a potential betrayal to also take place in relation with Israel.
Wow. When I saw that press conference with Zelensky, my mind immediately turned to what you just finished your sentence with, which was, don't be surprised if Israel is betrayed as well. The way, yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I fully agree with you. I think we need to accept that a betrayal is coming because Israel's two main war goals are the release of the hostages and the destruction of Hamas. Um, and it could absolutely be feasible for me to see a situation in which the American administration forces the Israeli government to accept a situation in which the hostages are released and Israel commits itself to accepting the pre-October 7th reality, which is the restoration of Hamas in power in Gaza.
Does this mean that Trump or the US have all the leverage in this triangle of negotiations between Israel, Hamas, and the US, or where's the card here in terms of Israel's position? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but just of just instinct, I think of Trump's speech in Congress this past week, mentioning the Iron Dome, kind of like creating it like Israel has. So those kind of ideas come into play where Israel might have a say, be like tougher or just a better position than we might be giving it credit for.
I don't think Israel has much leverage, unfortunately, in this situation. And I think the lack of leverage was seen just a couple of weeks ago when Israel abhorrently decided to vote in favor of a resolution that did not recognize Ukraine's territorial integrity, putting it within the camp of North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and perhaps the most egregious um, abusers of international law and international norms. It was a decision I publicly condemned,
Yeah.
and I stand by that condemnation. But I think it goes to show that the Israeli government is quite concerned about escalating um, tensions between Netanyahu and Trump, which we should remind your audiences that there is some um, resentment there, particularly from Trump towards Netanyahu. I don't think the president got over the fact that Netanyahu was forcibly put in a position of having to call Biden in 2020 after the election he so famously disputed. But he never got over the fact that Netanyahu called Biden to congratulate him and thereby extended recognition of the election results, which he himself never did. Um, so I think there is a lot of personal beef there, should we say? Um, I I know that following a report based on direct American conversations with Hamas, the Israeli government decided to hold talks with the American administration, but those talks weren't happening between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. They were happening between senior advisors within the Trump administration and Ron Dermer, um, one of Prime Minister Netanyahu's closest confidants. I think the reason why Netanyahu avoided having this conversation with Trump himself is he wanted to avoid a Zelensky type situation in the Oval Office in which political narratives would get too heated. And so the president would feel entitled to act as he did with Zelensky, which, in my opinion, was indefensible. And nonetheless, I don't think Israel holds much political or military leverage. I know there have been some efforts within the security establishment in Israel to move away from dependency of American support, particularly when it comes to surface-to-air defense systems. So we've heard talks about um, an Iron Beam system, which would um, use laser technology to bring down rockets being fired at Israel, would be significantly cheaper than buying Iron Dome batteries from the Americans, and would also tentatively make production for it viable within Israel itself, therefore boosting the Israeli security establishment and making it much more self-reliant. But at the same time, we need to come to terms with the fact that Israel's foreign policy approach, at least post 1973, has been one in which the country has openly embraced dependency on the Americans, because dependency on the Americans was seen as beneficial in the long term, as coupled with American political support, and of course the um, continued reinvigoration of the U.S.-Israel alliance. Um, in Hebrew, there's a phrase that is often being brought up nowadays called chibuk dov, which refers to a bear hug. And a lot of commentators in Israel and a lot of elites within the security and political establishment are concerned about the fact that we've reached the point where America has all the leverage over Israel, and if not all, at least the necessary leverage to push Israel to make concessions that Israel desperately does not want to make. Um, and I think if there's ever been a president in the White House that would be able to put Israel in such a position as President Trump.
Wow. Yoni, you need to come back again. I know we're good on time for a bit more, but you should come again for sure. Because you're this is a masterclass, and I have so many questions that come up because there's this dissonance in my mind. You know, Marco Rubio being the Secretary of State, being so pro-Israel, hard stance on Israel. What we saw with Columbia University's 400 million grant being taken away because the university didn't step up to prevent anti-Semitism, or, that whole situation with the campus protests. And at the same time, I'm listening you, and I kind of, that was my fear with what I saw with Zelensky, which was, like you said, there's a betrayal coming, and the size and scope of that, how would that look like? We don't know. And so help me consolidate these two parts of this conversation, which is kind of like a pro-Israel rhetoric with some actions, and on the other hand, finishing the war for political points.
Yeah. So look, the great thing about not belonging to any party or being beholden to any candidate is the fact that I enjoy intellectual freedom, and with intellectual freedom comes the capacity to condemn politicians when they do something wrong and recognize merits when they do something right. I think, as you alluded to before, there was a recent decision by the Trump administration to cut funding by approximately $400 million to the to Columbia University. Frankly, that's a decision I widely welcomed, and it should have been done years ago. I don't conflate this with freedom of speech. I conflate this with the fact that the university's administration stood by idoliously as it created a culture in which its students felt that it was legitimate and reasonable to mask themselves in a terrorist-like fashion while preventing students who pay tens of thousands of dollars in tuition from accessing their own classes, while also chanting for the globalization of the Intifada at the top of their lungs. The globalization of the Intifada has nothing to do with the liberation of Palestinians. It has nothing to do with calls for a peaceful or diplomatic resolution to the state of Israel. When the term intifada is invoked, it's invoked with the awareness that there is a collective trauma within Jewish, but particularly within the Israeli collective memory of the Second Intifada from the year 2000 through 2005, which was characterized by the horrific suicide bombing attacks against buses, against restaurants, against hotels, discotheques, in which Israeli women, children, men, the elderly were slaughtered indiscriminately by terrorist factions like Hamas, the PFLP, and other terror groups as well. And so calling for the globalization of the Intifada, particularly after the post-October 7th reality, in which we've seen the rate of anti-Semitism, especially violent anti-Semitism, experience an exponential rise, not only in the United States, not only in Canada, but in South America, in Europe, in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in countries you'd never expect before, like South Korea, Japan. The emergence of anti-Semitism in a much more violent, normalized way is ultimately what the globalized the Intifada crowd want to see. I don't think any other American campus would tolerate individuals walking around with a sharp white hood and tiki torches on college campuses calling for the lynching of Black Americans or Hispanic Americans. I don't think that would be accepted. I don't think that would be tolerated. And I don't think that would be justified under the First Amendment by any reasonable policymaker or university administrator. And so, Columbia has had this a long time coming, along with other universities that I hope experience similar backlash from the Trump administration. Um, and just because I'm concerned about Trump's handling of foreign policy doesn't mean I can't take a step back and recognize that there is merit in the decisions that were made here.
Yeah. No, it's when you put it that way, what we're seeing internationally is quite crazy. The rise of anti-Semitism. And so, Yoni, we're wrapping up this conversation. It was a quick one, but I hope a first of many, because really your insights are tremendous. Even though short on time, I'm taking a lot to think about. And so, outlook on 2025 as we wrap up. It's March. We've seen the renewal of the war, you could say, with some of the release of the hostages, heartbreaking scenes in the past few weeks, in a month, that I think all of us who are watching or listening can know that what I'm talking about.
Sure.
What's your outlook on 2025, Yoni? What are you expecting to see or wish to expect to see?
I'll start with the greatest dangers to the stability of the international system, and then I'll move down. I think um, America's hard power leverage over Ukraine and the way it has chosen to do so openly for the world to see, but also for um, the Kremlin officials to see and openly celebrate as they did, will lead to some sort of ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. As an outcome of that ceasefire, I expect to see two things. First of all, heightened military attention, heightened military tension along Central and Eastern European countries, particularly Poland, Lithuania, others, who will now interpret this ceasefire as leaving them in the first line of defense against future Russian aggression. On the other side, I expect we'll see a reinvigorated Russian economy after international and American sanctions are eased as a result of the ceasefire. In exchange, I believe that Russian efforts to re-implement its former sphere of influence in the Middle East will happen relatively quickly. As we've seen this week already, pro-Assad forces, who, by the way, is enjoying asylum in Russia, have started to take military action against the ruling faction in Syria, HTS. I suspect that a reinvigorated Russian economy would lead to a rise in Iran's ability to both sustain its own economy, but also begin to increase again its economic and military assistance to its proxy groups in the region, like the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And as far as Israel, I think Israel will have to contend with the reality that Hezbollah will rebuild its capabilities. And I don't think Hezbollah will allow for much time to happen before it starts violating its own ceasefire with Israel, even if it's not in the form of firing rockets, but in the form of moving south of the Litani River, which had sparked Israel's operation into Lebanon in the first place. And as far as the hostages, I desperately want to see all the hostages come home. Pray for it every single day, and I hope for it every single day. Having said that, I think Israel needs to make a decision as to what it prioritizes, either the destruction of Hamas or the release of all the hostages. And I think unless it does that in 2025, um, we won't see all of the hostages come home. I desperately hope I'm wrong. But a decision needs to be made within the Israeli political system.
Wow. Yeah, we'll be on the lookout for those outlooks on 2025. Yoni, a pleasure, an honor having you here. I hope to host you again soon, very soon, hopefully. And thank you for your ideas, your insights. They're very not only thought-provoking, but they shed a light on many truths we forget to see or think about. So thank you for your work.
Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to being back soon.